I will be setting the stage here with our two guests and asking them questions about the economy to get us started. But I just want to point out there is a microphone here, and we will take questions from the audience. So if you feel like you have a question, please go ahead and stand up and walk to the microphones. And I kind of like to do this as if you hear something that they're talking about and you want to ask a question, go ahead and stand up and we can work that in, because if you have to wait until we get to the end or something like that, it may not be topical anymore. So this may be the kind of the best way to do it. We've now introduced everybody, so I will kind of skip over that, but point out that Dana works for an organization that is responsible for taking the pulse of the American people. And the pulse of the American people, I think, could best be described as pretty miserable these days. They're getting raises, jobs are available like crazy, and yet consumer confidence is not very strong, and people are concerned about the direction of the economy. What's the explanation for that?
Sure, it's really interesting when we look at our measure of consumer confidence. It's not that bad. I mean, certainly not as high as it was before the pandemic. But when we look at, there is this dichotomy in terms of the present situation, how people are feeling right now. As you mentioned, many people are working, their wages are rising. But when they look to the future, yes, that has taken a tumble. And so I think people are very concerned about rising inflation, prices for everything. Rising inflation, prices for everything from food to gasoline to services, goods, housing, all of those prices are rising. Meanwhile, interest rates are starting to go up. And certainly anyone who's looking to buy a house is very concerned about that mortgage rate, which is now, I think, the highest we've seen in a few years. So with all of that, people's expectations for the economy are definitely starting to slip.
It's not unusual during a time of economic dislocation for people to be worried about what's going forward, but Avri, this is a very different kind of dislocation than we've seen. It makes it very hard to understand what's starting it and what's ending it.
I think inflation, so let's put it this way. If inflation was easily forecastable, you would know that every month it goes up by 1% or 2%. Everything would be fine. We could do it, we economists could figure it out, everything would be indexed and we're all set. The problem is inflation, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, I was in Israel in the 80s when inflation was 400%, I think it's 45 was the highest in 1983 or 84, and everything rises unevenly, so the surge costs go up a lot. The other thing that happened with inflation is here as well, is that taxes go up because a lot of taxes are not indexed. So the capital gains tax is the most horrible example of how we're being taxed on phantom gains, and it doesn't look like the government wants to do anything about it. In fact, they're going the other way. They want to raise it, which is really outrageous. So people are worried about that. And the other thing that has happened, which relates to the market, is because since probably 2010, we have not been able to have safe assets with positive real returns, meaning adjusted for inflation. People have shifted their portfolio into riskier securities. So everybody's now holding, on average, portfolios that are riskier than they should have. And that's a big problem overall. So I think all of these are side effects, so to speak, of inflation that might be worse than just rising prices.
Dana, the Fed is in the unusual situation of not having models that really work in this situation. We've had a lot of inflationary episodes, not for a while, but we've had them, and we've had a lot of economic crashes, and we've had wars, but we've not had a pandemic a global pandemic since modern statistics were invented. How do they fly this airplane in the dark?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's going to be quite difficult because when you think about the inflationary drivers, you have drivers that are pushed by demand and other drivers that are pushed by supply. And right now, they're all coalescing into a huge inflation problem. So what are these supply versus demand drivers? So on the demand side, Again, labor markets are very strong. We're seeing labor shortages because it's difficult to find people, but wages are rising, and people also still have some of those, some savings from the fiscal stimulus from last year, either the direct checks to households or child tax credits, et cetera. And so people have money, and we see them spending it. And even in last week's GDP report, even though GDP was negative in the quarter, consumer spending was healthy. People are buying things. However, the Fed can address those demand drivers by raising interest rates, but the Fed can't really do anything about supply drivers of inflation, namely two things. One being supply chain disruptions because of the pandemic. Indeed, the pandemic is not over, certainly not for China, where many of our factories are located. And so every time you have a shutdown in Shanghai or Beijing, that means fewer products are being produced and then shipped to the US, and that causes prices to rise. And the second aspect that's driving inflation is the unfortunate and horrible war in Ukraine, where both Ukraine and Russia are major producers of commodities, including oil, natural gas, metals, food in terms of grains, and even sunflower oil, which goes into a lot of food products. And so because you have the war happening there, it's shocking commodity prices globally, and so that's going to affect the US. The Fed can do very little to address supply chain issues or rising global commodity prices. So you're absolutely right. The Fed is in a pickle. The Fed is going to raise interest rates to address inflation, but there's a huge question as to whether they can get inflation back to the 2% target without causing a recession in the US.
I want to ask about the war, but I want to go backwards in time just a little bit and ask you, Professor. Reporters had a drinking game last year when anytime anybody from the Fed said the word transitory, we had to take a drink, and thank goodness they have let us sober up. They've sort of dropped that formulation. But isn't it true that there are some things that are transitory? And do you believe the Fed people when they say we're going to see inflation maybe not come down to 2%, but we're going to see it come down kind of on its own as time goes, as we go through this year?
Well, I think Dana probably has much more to say, but I would say that historically, inflation doesn't really come down by itself. I mean, the Fed, like she said, what she said was 100% true. There are some things the Fed can do, some things the Fed can't do. And about inflation, we can say what they say about war. You know how you start, you never know how it ends. So therefore, I think the real problem, what they should have done, is really not send checks to everybody. That's something they could have done. And there's a very good chance, and it's not me saying this is Larry Summers, as you probably know, saying that basically we probably would not have been in such a bad situation in terms of the ability of people to spend. So I don't think anybody knows. The only thing I'd say historically, and referring to the Israeli episode, which was really a unique episode of how the government took a very brave step. It was headed by a well-known economist, the Economist, the head of the Israeli central bank, was a well-known economist, and they took a very brave plan which indexed everything to the dollar, and they also had to there's bank stocks. I don't want to talk about at length unless you're interested, but there was an issue of bank stocks that were manipulated, and everybody held them as a source of value. So they handled all of this and were able to get the inflation down within a year from 445% to 19%, and then down to European levels. Same here, nothing happens by itself. By itself, inflation tends to be self-perpetuating, and something kind of needs to be done. Having said that, nobody knows.
Dana, do you have anything to add on that score in terms of the idea that there are some things like used car prices that are coming down?
Yes, we are seeing some prices starting to come off. You mentioned used car prices, and some of that's a function of people being priced out, lack of supply, and also the fact that interest rates are going up and many people still finance vehicles. But for the most part, we're starting to see a shift in terms of what's driving inflation. Certainly in the last reading, a lot of it on the good side was food and gasoline, right? And that's directly linked to the war in Ukraine. But we're also seeing services prices pick up in terms of housing, and that's linked to the fact that home prices are starting to rise, and that's filtering through to rents. But also prices for lots of other types of services are rising because they're over their pandemic, they're getting back out there, they're engaging in in-person services, and still you have labor shortages in many of these in-person services types of jobs. And so that's feeding through wage inflation, and that's affecting inflation or the prices that consumers are seeing. I would note that I think that there are some elements of inflation that are probably not going to go away on their own, that are going to be more longer lasting. And two of them I would mention include wage pressures from labor shortages, which are not going to go away because we have an aging demographic. And then the second thing is semiconductors. So, for example, we use semiconductors or computer chips in almost everything. Everyone has a cell phone. Your car probably has hundreds of computer chips within it. And so the more we demand high-tech goods, the more you're going to see a shortage in computer chips, and that's going to feed through in terms of the price of items.
Well, you mentioned wages, and I'm just wondering, I'll throw it out to either one of you. What happened to all the workers? We had the JOLTS report, which is the job openings and labor turnover report from the Labor Department today, and there's a record number of 11.5 million open jobs right now.
I know it seems strange, especially when we talk about the unemployment rate being at 3.6%, I think it is, and so essentially 94% of the population is working. To say that and then to say we have a labor shortage. Some of that labor shortage is because many people retired during the pandemic. They retired because they were either afraid of becoming infected, or their assets appreciated because stock prices went up, home prices went up, and so they saw their net worth increase, and they said, well, this is a great time to retire. Some of those folks are coming back now, but most of them probably are not, because it's very difficult to unretire after you retired. I remember my parents, it took a year or more to get both of them retired. And then also you have many persons with young children, men and women, who have not returned to the labor market because of childcare issues. There's something like 50 to 100,000 childcare workers that are missing, that have not returned to the labor market, and so that's a challenge for a lot of parents.
Oh, Avri?
I'll just add one sentence, and that is that basically we also should keep in mind that it's not even. It's not like the shortage is not in every sector. Some sectors are a lot worse than others, and the sectors that are a lot worse than other sectors are the travel, the restaurants, all these sectors where people were getting paid very little, and even if they raised it by 20%, was still very little. So those have a problem. I think this will go into a structural change. One thing I would say that is based on some research that I'm doing with people at Northwestern on technological change is that things will change a lot in terms of working at home and so on. So what we're seeing is we're in the middle of this process. I mean, my feeling, and based on some stuff that we have done, is that there is going to be a major change in the way people work, and they will adjust, like you said, families. So working from home is a lot better for women with kids. So I think, that's what seems to be the case, much more flexible. And so we are in the middle of a change into where remote work will come in, and we will have to see how this all plays out.
Well, we tend to go in cycles. I remember back in the late 90s, we got down to 3.5% unemployment, and a lot of older people were coming out of retirement. Maybe they take a job at Walmart or something for a little extra money because it was so easy to get the work. Do you think we are going to see that again?
When we look at the data, we are seeing some folks who have said they're retired. We don't know if they are legally retired, but they said they had retired and now they're coming back. but it's still not going to be enough to make up for the demographic pressures we're seeing. And indeed, even if we did not have a pandemic, you had roughly 10,000 people, I think, a month retiring and leaving the labor market. And we don't have enough younger people between the ages of 25 and 55 to replace all those retired workers. And the key issue is even amongst the people who are retiring, many of them are either very skilled, and so we're losing that skill set, or they're in manual labor types of jobs that many younger people may not be interested in, especially if the wages are not there. So this is a serious crisis of labor, and we were going to get here anyway, and the pandemic really just accelerated that behavior.
Can I just add one quick note? I think one thing that's happening regarding technological change is a lot of things are accelerating. Restaurants are getting robots, hotels are getting robots, so we're moving in the direction we would have moved otherwise, but a lot faster because of the pandemic. And it's also about remote working, like I was saying earlier. A lot of jobs are going to be remote. I mean, my daughter is remote forever. And I think that a lot of, and if you think about the economics of it, so this whole thing with coming to the office 1 or 2 days a week, so you're saying I'm going to hold an office for someone who's showing up once a week, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So the economic pressures to move more and more towards remote, even though we all like to get together, but you know, if you're looking at the bottom line, you're saying, am I going to have an office building for, you know, $1 million a year? It probably will come down to not to do it.
To combine those two thoughts, you were talking about the acceleration of change in the economy. Before the pandemic, globalization was a big issue. People saying offshoring by U.S. companies was pushing jobs out of the United States, weakening our industrial base, and then all of a sudden we had the pandemic and everybody said we need to bring the factories back, and yet we can't find the workers. So where does this leave the idea of globalization?
Well, this is high speculation, so you go first.
Sure, indeed. When we think about the outlook, both in the short run as well as over the next decade, deglobalization is at the top of the list, and it's actually highly inflationary, and it also weakens growth. Why is this the case? Well, if you think about the reasons why businesses develop these supply chains and outsource labor, it was to save money, right? And so if you bring all of that, you know, all the workers and all the supply chains home, that means you're going to have to pay whatever the market wage is here, or in in the US, let's say, or wherever your home country is. And so that means that everything's going to cost more, and that's going to be filtered down to the customer and to anyone who's along the supply chain all the way to the end, which is again the customer. And it also means slower growth because you have less trade. And so a big issue for us that we're looking at in terms of risks include something called industrial policies, where essentially the government tells businesses where they can invest and where they can place their factories and where they can situate their supply chains. And that's in the language. It was an executive order last year from the administration stating that for a number of reasons, including national security, concerns about economic disruption, concerns about having to buy products from nations that we don't necessarily get along with. Because of all those issues, the government is looking for businesses to do a number of things. One is to diversify their supply chains, or friendshore, as Treasury Secretary Yellen said. So essentially, you place your supply chains in economies that the U.S. is friendly with. So, for example, Canada and Mexico, we have a giant trade agreement, the USMCA, so those look like viable candidates for friendshoring. You can also do something called nearshoring, where you go into a region and you just build out all your supply chains there, and then you just engage in that region. There's also reshoring or onshoring, where you break up your supply chains and you bring all of your production home. So businesses are going to have to decide to either write their own narrative and figure this out before the regulation comes, or wait for the regulation to come. But all of this means that it's going to cost the consumer more money, and we're going to see slower growth as a consequence.
Thank you. Great analysis. Let me just add one thing to that, and that is the only good news. So this is all bad news, as you have heard, because this means, globalization is good news. We want to have cheaper supply, and we want to all work together, and it works for all the countries. The only good news is that generally the U.S. and the rich countries, and that I think goes to the war in Ukraine. So the general philosophy is, my philosophy is that democratic countries that are open with capitalistic system just do better, empirically. Even if you don't think this is good, you think all kinds of things are different, they just do better. So we have more money. So we can withstand this kind of disruption a lot better than the other guys, dictatorships and countries that really cannot do this. So we'll emerge better than others. This is no consolation. It's still going to be inflation, rising prices, and we're not going to do well. It's better to work together. But I think if you'll allow me to just segue a little to the war.
Sure.
So I think that's the whole thing. I mean, if you think about how we won the Cold War in 2 words, we had more money. And so we just kept investing in all kinds of weird systems. Remember Star Wars? And the other side just went bankrupt. And we can do the same thing now. And sometimes we don't need to do it, they do it themselves. I mean, the Russians are definitely shooting themselves in the foot, even if, regardless of what we think of this war. And I try to help Ukrainian academics, so you know what I think. But regardless of that, they're shooting themselves in the foot. The Chinese are now having a huge disruption because of illogical, irrational COVID steps. So basically, we are still in a position that if we keep our system going, we keep the democracy, we keep capitalism, we'll have enough money to be able to withstand all these threats and thrive. So this is my hopeful statement for the day. And since we're talking about wild speculation and general ideas, but go ahead.
Well, we can build on that and keep the conversation overseas for a moment and talk about the impact of the war. Certainly it's having an impact on inflation in the United States, but it's having an impact on inflation and growth seriously in Europe. And what's your view on what's going to happen to the European economy, and how does that affect us here?
Sure, happy to start. Our base case is not for a recession in Europe more broadly, meaning the EU plus the UK and the sorted Central and Eastern European economies, but we do expect there will be recessions in Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine because unfortunately that's the theater of war, Russia because of the sanctions, and potentially our base case could be set aside if the European Union decides en masse that it's going to place an embargo on Russian oil imports. And so that would mean that natural gas prices and also oil prices potentially globally will increase. And so that's going to put a lot of strain on European consumers who are already facing very high inflation and there are pockets that have not yet hit full employment. So we could potentially see a recession in Europe, but that's not our base case.
So first of all, since we're talking about a war, let me just say, having participated in a war, it's terrible, should not happen, and it's just unthinkable what these people are going through. Having said that, I think in terms of the economics, I agree with everything Dana said, but coming back to my earlier point, the nice thing is we have enough money. I mean, we'll pay a little more for gas. We're still paying a lot less than in other countries. European, the same thing. Most European countries are rich countries. They can withstand it. The other side is in big trouble. So that's the only hopeful thing to see, and I agree with everything that Dana said about forecasts, although I don't do forecasts.
Well, given that, Dana, is there anything policymakers can do to mitigate the impact on the U.S. economy, or is this just something, as Avri suggests, we can live with?
I think.
Sorry, I said we'll have to live with. Not
Have.
we. Not that I would like to live with.
But we are able
to clarify. Yes, we're able.
So there will be repercussions for the United States, and a lot of it's going to come through the channel of inflation, and also supply chains, because indeed, when you think about it, Ukraine produces 70% of the world's neon, and neon is a critical implement for making computer chips. And computer chips are in everything, as I mentioned before, your car, your cell phone, your appliances, etc. And then also, because Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of grains, roughly 16% of the world's exports come out of those two economies, we're going to see shortages of food. And that's going to be very negative. That's going to cause higher inflation. And then you also have higher inflation for a number of metals, again, that go into semiconductors, plus natural gas and oil. So all of that, these are global prices that are rising. So that means it's going to affect the U.S. through inflation. And indeed, we've downgraded our forecast for the United States quite precipitously. Initially, we were thinking growth of 3.5% this year, and now we're looking at 3%. At least we were before last week's GDP report. And fold that in, having a negative print, even though underlying growth was okay, when you do the calculus, you're looking at something like 2.5–2.25% growth, which is getting back to the pace that we were experiencing before the pandemic, but certainly a big slowdown after growing almost 6% last year. So the effects of the war are going to be mainly through inflation, weighing on growth, weighing on the consumer in the U.S.
Well, going on from here, Avri, what do you think the impact of the pandemic is going to have on the economy? How do we come out changed once we get through all the ructions that we're going through now?
So again, they do the forecasts. I don't do forecasts. But the angle that I would have on the pandemic is what I've said before, is that basically it accelerates the processes that we have seen before and would have happened, which is going to remote work and remote communication. I think that at some point, if we're thinking about universities, and I've said this to the provost who left and others, I think, yes, we have the dean here, I think universities as well will have to adjust to a flexible model where essentially the way I see it is like a seamless classroom where people can join from everywhere, and the same thing for work. So all these things are accelerated by the pandemic, as well as the fact that people, what we were talking about earlier, these labor shortages that will increase automation. So all these things that were happening towards a major technological change in the economy are accelerating, and now we can't stop them. So again, going back to the research, this is my colleagues at Northwestern did the early study. We see that things that start, they just change. So it's not like, it's not going back. Even if the pandemic ended tomorrow, people have declared it end, but as you see, I don't think so. But even if it really ended tomorrow, it would still, the world will have changed.
I'm wondering, Dana, there was a time about 2 years ago when you would have paid anything for toilet paper. You couldn't get it, couldn't get a lot of household items. And since then, we've had inflation and people getting a little bit used to paying higher prices, not liking it, but at the same time, they're also seeing their wages go up. I wonder if the so-called Amazon economy, Walmart economy, is going to come back where people start saying, no, I don't want to keep chasing inflation. I want to go back to where companies pushed it down, pushed it down, pushed it down. I'm going to start comparing again on websites and only buy things at the lowest price.
I agree with you. I think certainly the Amazon, I call it, well, some people call it the Amazonization of prices, of inflation, where essentially with Amazon, you go there and all the prices are within a certain range, and the range is fairly low, and most businesses would not dare break out of that range. And so we are going to see discounting. We are going to see people, as Professor mentioned, that one big change is the fact that people have moved to digital and online consumption, and that's not going to go away. And so certainly as people see inflation continue to rise and their expectations begin to really build and get baked in that inflation is going to stay high forever, you are going to see that demand. In fact, we have our own survey of consumers, as you mentioned, and consumers are already saying that they're thinking about, maybe not consuming or demanding discounts from businesses. So I think that's going to happen, and that's going to be an important dampener of inflation going forward. And I also agree that remote work is something that we're not going to put that genie back into the bottle, but it's also disinflationary. It's great for businesses because you don't have to have an office. You don't necessarily have to pay someone as much if you can source that labor from an inexpensive locale. But also it's great for the consumer. It's great for the worker. You don't have to spend money on dry cleaning and commuting and all those things. So, I mean, there are a number of factors that could help reduce inflation, but my view is that you still have these big drivers of inflation that are just not necessarily going to go away, and we're still going to see prices be higher going forward than we have over the last 20, 30 years.
I want to ask, as long as we're on inflation, about how, and I know you've done some work on this, Professor, the psychology of investing changes. Somebody yesterday said something that struck me as probably very true, that for the Fed, market functioning is about, do people pay their counterparties? Do they collect the securities they're buying, and do they give them the money? For an investor, market functioning is, do my stocks go up? They've gotten used to the fact that they don't go down. How are we seeing changes in investment philosophy these days?
So I think that there are, as I said, there was a big shift towards riskier assets because of the Fed policy and very low interest rates, which were negative, real negative interest rates. So that's one thing. The other thing is because of this, the social networks and all that, people that have, let's put it this way, we all know that the optimal strategy for everybody is to just invest in indices, and in fact, this has happened. So as you know, the investment in indices has increased dramatically, but every now and then there's some weird stuff going on, like with the AMC stock, and people that have no business being in investors, or investing in individual stocks do that. And so some weird stuff can happen, but I think the good news is that overall these things equilibrate. I mean, a lot of people could lose a lot of money if you short the stock in the wrong time. You lose a lot of money, but at the end of the day, I still think efficient markets are efficient markets at the end. So I don't think there's a fundamental shift, except there's a lot of people. The one thing that's bad is that for individual stocks is there could be clienteles who are really not very knowledgeable, and as you say, just watch their stocks and they go up, and that's all they know. They have no general idea of what to do in investing. So we call for more financial education, which means we should get more work, teaching more people about how to invest and so forth.
Well, are the markets to some extent rigged against the average investor now because so much is done by computers, black boxes, and high-speed trading, where you don't really, if you find out some information, you're way behind already?
Right, exactly. That's exactly the reason why individual investors have no business trading stocks back and forth. And you should really put money in indices. And what I would say to you, I mean, this is my individual philosophy. I did it in 2008 when the markets were going down. I got some money from my father's inheritance, as it turned out, and I was just putting the money in and watching it go down and saying, okay, look, this is just the way it is. The question you have to ask yourself, do you like your portfolio? Do you want to be in, let's say, QQQ, which is the NASDAQ index? If the answer is yes, you buy it. And if it went down, you still buy it because now it's cheaper. You don't ask yourself, are you buying it to speculate on what it's going to do? Because as you said correctly, there's no way you can do these people pay $300 million, as you know, to have a faster cable so they could do 2 nanoseconds faster, what chance do you have, right? So I think the case for index investing has never been stronger than it is now.
Could I ask a question,
Yes,
please?
please. And I hope you're the first of many.
All right, I hope so too. You know, we're meeting here in New York City, a city that seems to be encountering a huge amount of difficulty. Rising crime rates, homelessness, and at the same time, towers are being built that only the most wealthy can even consider purchasing them. How does, and there's a feeling, a very strong feeling, that at least a large segment of the American population is no longer part of the American dream. So my question, and I know it's a big question, I really don't know that anybody can answer these questions, but it seems that this is being neglected. And we have I think the strongest division in my memory, I'm 82 years old, in my memory of between our political parties, two different visions of what this country should be. How does this relate to the discussion we're having now? What can government do to include those people who are excluded, and being excluded turn to crime and violence, and perhaps strangulating this city? So I'm asking you, I know it's a big question, and I know that it may be beyond the answers of any one of us, but still, what can be done to preserve this country, in some ways the most important country in the world?
Excellent questions. Thank you. I'll try to tackle some of these answers. So when we think about New York City, and I grew up in New York, in Brooklyn and Kensington, and I remember the bad old days from the 80s and 90s. I was born in the 70s, so I don't remember the 70s so much. But certainly we did have a very extended period of time where things were really bad. And it seems like we've gotten back there. And what the pandemic has done is actually caused a shift in demographics, where many people fled the inner cities, large inner cities like New York, and they moved to the suburbs, right? So people moved to Brooklyn, Long Island, New Jersey, Westchester, et cetera. And you had a lot of people who have moved to what we would call secondary and tertiary cities. So cities like Austin, right? Or, somewhere, or, in Tennessee, into the Midwest and into the South, to these cities that before weren't very heavily populated. But with remote work, it allowed people to make that move. And so we've seen a hollowing out of inner cities, and a lot of the wealth has left. And so what do you have left? You have a lot of people who are quite desperate. So that's what's going on. And part of the reason why you still have these penthouses going up in New York is because New York City is an international hub. And so you have a lot of very wealthy international people who can still come and afford and buy, but it doesn't really help people who are living here domestically. So what can government do? So one very important policy that I saw the Fed do over the pandemic was they changed how they defined full employment. So before, full employment kind of probably meant, the unemployment rate is at some optimal level, right? At the pace where you don't create any inflation. But that didn't speak to all the different demographics. And so the Fed changed how it views full employment. It said full employment is broad and inclusive, meaning we're going to look at many different metrics, and we're going to make sure that not just the average American is doing well, but many different demographics, women, young people, old people, different racial groups. And so the Fed was highly focused on achieving full employment, meaning as many groups getting to that point before they started raising interest rates. Unfortunately, inflation outflanked them because they thought the pandemic would go away and that everything would be resolved, and it hasn't. The pandemic's been this repeated shock, and then you add on the war. So again, things the Fed could not control and can't control. But still in all, the Fed was very, very focused on making sure that there was, full employment, meaning many more people can enjoy that. In terms of the government, I mean, I'm not going to make any comments about political parties, but the thing is that it's very divided in Washington, and there's probably not going to be a lot that's going to get passed. However, one thing that was passed was the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And infrastructure is a surefire way to spread prosperity, not only for consumers, but for businesses. It lowers the cost of transportation and improves the way that businesses can move their products around and consumers can move around. It also prevents, damage due to environmental factors. So if there's more investment in infrastructure, then we'll catch up with China, right? Which has dumped a ton of money into infrastructure. Not all of it good money, money after bad projects. But certainly, I think that if there's a bipartisan effort to invest in not only just fixing what's broken in the U.S., and there's about $2 trillion that's broken, but also investing in new types of infrastructure. So I think that those are areas that are bipartisan, that everyone can agree upon, that the government can actually do some good for the long run.
So this was a great answer, and also, I agree with you. I was here in the late 80s and 90s, and I would say two things, since I don't, we've already covered most of the topics that should be covered in this. First of all, I'm with you. I'm very, very concerned about the polarization. Very often I find myself I can't vote for anybody because I don't go for the extreme. And the only experience I would add, I grew up in Israel in a socialist system, and for many years recently I was at a research affiliation with a Swedish university. So I figured I know how the system works in Sweden, and I can tell you lots of stories. Just to say that overall, and we could talk about it all afternoon, but overall, people that say we should go to a socialist system, even mild socialist system as in Europe, I think need to think a lot about it. There are lots of effects, there are lots of incentives, just like we teach, that occur and happen in real life, and I could give you tons and tons of stories, and we have to be very careful to move away from a system that brought us to great prosperity for all, relatively speaking. It's not perfect, lots of things to fix, as Dana said, but we shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater.
I would just add, because it's something I've done a lot of work on, there are things cities can do, and I think that the focus probably needs to be more in the city. Mayor Adams and the city council going forward because of the dysfunction that we see at the top of our political system. But I did a series of stories on Detroit and Pittsburgh. Both were major American cities, major American manufacturing centers. Both fell apart. And Pittsburgh came back relatively quickly. And obviously Detroit has not. We all know that story. But Detroit basically didn't have two things that Pittsburgh had. One is the infrastructure. And Dana mentioned infrastructure. Pittsburgh was blessed with a lot of millionaires, who would be the equivalent of billionaires today, who built a massive park system, an art system, and all of that stuff made the city still attractive to be in. And Detroit didn't have that. And the other is research universities, Pitt and Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, who were technologically based and throwing off a lot of spin-off jobs. And Detroit has a wonderful college, Wayne State University, but that's it. And so they didn't have the same impact. The University of Michigan's not far away, but everybody wants to live in Ann Arbor because it's a fun little town. So we now have an emphasis on moving away from manufacturing. New York, of course, went down in the 1970s because it was a manufacturing center. It rebuilt itself as a financial center, and now under Mayor Bloomberg, he obviously owns my company, but they set up the Cornell Tech Center on Roosevelt Island. And those are the kind of things that will drive cities in the future. And that's why if you're looking to get something done, look at the city level. It's much easier, as my boss would say, to get things done than it is through Washington. I want to go back now to the investment question, because I have one more question in that area, but I know there's a lot of interest in it. You can duck the question if you want, because I know Charlie Brown once said, you never talk about religion, politics, or the great pumpkin. And to that list, I would add Bitcoin. And by Bitcoin, I mean all cryptocurrencies. But what do you think the future of that is? Does it play a role in finance? Is it a speculative joke, as Warren Buffett would say? Or is there something here that we need to pay attention to?
I would say that I would go with Warren Buffett with some. So let's say there are two things here. There is the technology, the blockchain technology, and then there are the Bitcoin. So the blockchain technology has lots of uses. It's hugely wasteful at this point in time, but I'm sure some solutions will be found, although I think I read in Bloomberg actually that they don't think it will happen in the short run, but I'm sure something can be done to make it green. So in the work that I do in the entertainment industry, I talked to a woman that actually has a blockchain for movie budgets where everybody can see the ledger, so it can add to a lot of transparency. The technology is the technology, and it's great. Now, Bitcoin is a speculative asset. It's like, goes up and down for no reason, and I mean for good reason, supply and demand, but it is a speculative asset. Some countries that are adopting it as a currency seems to me a crazy idea at this point in time. Having said that, there's, of course, countries could do digital currency. That's very different. It's not like a Bitcoin, but it would be a digital dollar, a digital euro. So you don't have to carry cash, but it will still have the central bank. And for the people who say, I mean, my students, when I talk to them about Bitcoin and the like, they say, oh, we don't trust central banks. And I say, okay, so you trust some programmers in Moscow? I mean, that's what you're doing here. And so, and by the way, there are lots of other issues which we can talk about. I mean, you can lose all your money. People have lost tens of millions of dollars if things go wrong. There's nobody to talk to. And I do trust central banks, having perhaps being an economist, that they actually know what they're doing. I know some of the people who are doing this in various countries, and they know what they're doing. I don't trust the programmers wherever they are. So I think at this point it's a speculative asset. I think the technology is good and probably will have some uses. I hope they can do it greener, because this is outrageous waste there. But and I think digital currencies have hope. I mean, different countries might actually end up issuing them, but it's very different than a Bitcoin or whatever it's called, horse coin. No, there's something Dogecoin.
Yeah. I'm wondering, because you talk to business leaders all the time, what the general business view is.
I think businesses are still trying to figure it out. I agree. It is these crypto assets or crypto tokens, which essentially are entities that behave like money in many ways, are highly speculative. Yes, and my own personal view is that they should be treated as an asset class, not as a parallel currency world, because as the professor mentioned, even if it's tethered to some financial asset like U.S. Treasuries, you can still have runs on these assets. And there's no recourse. There's no FDIC or NCUA that come in, sweep in. You don't have the Fed who can come and sell assets to help stabilize the market in these things. So I think that they're not going to go away. The technology is very good because it decentralizes and allows public access to know everyone who's in at least the transactions in the ledger, even if you don't know who is engaging in those transactions, which is a problem you don't know. But certainly these assets are going to be out there. And I think that the only way to put the genie back into the bottle is if all central banks issue what are called central bank digital currencies. as the professor mentioned, where essentially those currencies are backed by fiat currency that central banks control. And consequently, if you do have some dislocation in the market, you have a central bank that can come in, step in, address the issue. And it can also be a great way to address the fact that many people around the world are unbanked, right? So if you can access this digital currency through a digital wallet that's backed by a central bank, you can do this on your cell phone, right? You don't need a computer, you don't need to mine currencies, and that sort of thing. So I think that this is going to continue to evolve, and many of the products that we see now may not survive, and certainly they can all become obsolete if it is the case that, for example, China bans all digital assets, but you can use a digital yuan, right? So they have established a central bank digital asset, digital currency. And I think it's also very important because, for example, you asked why would, say, like El Salvador adopt crypto? It's because they have such high inflation. Their own currency is very volatile. So potentially a central bank digital currency can address that and really help democratize the financial system to pull in the unbanked, but also you need guidelines and guardrails to help protect your basic investor as well as your uninitiated investor.
Let me just say two quick comments. So one thing is, why would El Salvador do the cryptocurrency? So as I mentioned, Israel indexed to the dollar in the 80s, and that's a real anchor. Whereas you take Bitcoin that moves 20% a day, that's not a very good anchor for inflationary environment. And the other thing is just a casual comment. My nephew has a big firm that does a lot of stuff for cryptocurrency investment in Israel. He doesn't invest a penny in cryptocurrencies.
I want to move on to another controversial topic, as long as we're stepping in things here, and that is climate change. And leave aside the politics of it, but the economics of it. How do we use economics to research and develop solutions and think about where we go with this?
Sure. Whatever your politics are, whether you believe that there is something called climate change, I think we can all see the effects of inclement weather, and plus we're tracking these things more often, so that could also be the case why it looks like the climate's changing. I'm not going to go into whether it is or isn't, because I don't want to get into trouble, but it is very important in terms of environmental impacts on the economy. Each time there's a major storm, there's a destruction in wealth, there's a destruction in infrastructure that impacts large cities and municipalities, and also affects people. So when we think about, and also it's very important in terms of climate injustice, where, for example, oftentimes the poor community is placed below the sea level, and that's the thing that gets flooded, or you already have a poor community and the polluting plant is allowed to move in. So we have to think about these things, and certainly the Fed, and not just the Fed, but many other central banks are focused on climate policy when it comes to financial stability, because the thing is that with every event, there's an insurance cost. Can insurers and financial firms manage the existential costs of each of these events? And the question is, do they have the assets? Is part of their risk weighting? And so, again, regardless of whatever your politics are, it's very important for financial stability, and also in terms of how we even build infrastructure. Should we be building in Lower Manhattan if we know that, the 100-year storm is going to happen every 5 years and it gets flooded? So those kinds of questions are hugely important for economics.
Let me say one thing. I think that basically, and actually I have done some work on cost-benefit analysis, and actually I have a paper now on climate change as well. So in terms of the economics, exactly disasters and things like that. So I've thought about this, and I think the key here, and the same thing applies to any public policy issue, such as the pandemic and such as climate change, there is a science in economics or a division of economics called cost-benefit analysis. In fact, it's used routinely by the EPA to make just decisions like that. In other words, should we build a bridge? Should we, do something in the river? All these kinds of decisions. I looked at it. The most recent one had, I forget what it was, but it was something to do with environmental issues as well. So we can quantify a lot of these issues, and even if you think we can't, in climate change, the problem is really to show the causality. But in a lot of cases, if we do cost-benefit analysis, we don't even need that. We can quantify, for example, the costs of polluted air, and we can show that perhaps there are some steps we should take regardless of what we think in terms of the causality in climate change. So if we use cost-benefit analysis for this, if we use cost-benefit analysis for the pandemic, we would in both cases be in much better place. Very often you can't quantify everything, but I'll just give you one example from the pandemic, and I actually did write about it in several newspaper pieces during the pandemic. When they wanted to open schools in New York City, I used some data from Wharton and some other data to show that actually the rate of infection within the kids, that the kids in school had to be 200 times higher in order for us, we just used everything we could quantify, so the rate of infection is to be 200 times higher in order not to open schools. So you get some of these things where it's so obvious that you should do it that it's extremely helpful. And again, cost-benefit analysis could be used for all the pollution, everything that you could quantify. So I think it would really be very useful to move in that direction, and it's a very useful tool for government. So this is my little pitch for cost-benefit analysis and policy.
I wanted to stay with you, Doctor, because I know you've done a lot of work in entertainment, and I'm curious how the entertainment world changes coming out of the pandemic. Everybody bought Pelotons and Netflix subscriptions, and then we've heard a lot of people selling their bikes, and now they're giving up their Netflix account. Is it really that fragile? I mean, this is going to be a streaming world.
So first of all, you're exactly right. This is going to be a streaming world. If you look at the numbers, in 2021, the industry is saying that they have done really well in the sense that, we got to half of where we were in terms of revenues for movie theaters. It's a little bit less than half, but what does that mean? It means people are not going back to the movies. There's all the demographics that people look at. But in principle, I think streaming is the future. And the thing about Netflix had two advantages. One is the first mover advantage, and the second, they supposedly had information advantage. If you remember, they were founded in 1997, and they send these DVDs. So they've been collecting information about our habits for many years. And they have been able to do fairly well with series, but this is just by flooding the market. In terms of movies, I was really surprised to see that they're not doing very well. And after I thought about it, because I've done research for 2 decades about what makes movies tick, and it's still the same thing. In other words, they haven't been able with this micro data to do much better than we have been able to do with macro data. But the thing is, we had what people are willing to pay. Whereas I don't know what to make of if you're watching 2 minutes. I mean, I flip through series. You watch a movie for 2 minutes, what does it mean? So I think the Netflix business model, which is vertically integrated, you have production and then you have streaming, there's no real reason to do it anymore. In other words, the producers should produce, the streamers should stream, and we've done work on vertical integration. It has to be some anti-competitive level. Now the competition has heated up. So the world that we're going to, I would not invest in AMC in the movie theaters unless they make big changes. They're gonna stay small. Some people will go out, some movies will do okay, but not too many. And I wouldn't invest in Netflix per se. I would invest in streaming, like you said. It is the world of streaming. And the model is still evolving. The current model of, trying to do subscription doesn't make that much sense to me. You need to have either a cable TV model where there are dedicated channels and there's some streamer that sells it to you, or just production and then selling to the highest bidder among the streamers. So the model is evolving, and Netflix did okay when they had the first mover advantage. I would not invest in Netflix either, but I don't make predictions. Maybe they'll think of something, they'll expand, they'll, have merger with other companies, so they might be able to do that.
I think also there are two other issues with that particular company. Number one is they spent too much, right? They spent tons and tons of money producing their own content with this vertical integration. And also the second issue is that they didn't really link themselves up with Hollywood, meaning the movie makers, right? Whereas Disney and Amazon and these other streaming platforms do have relationships with the companies that produce movies, and they're not incurring the cost of actually having to create the content. So I think those were two issues. I'm not going to say they're mistakes or anything. I don't call stocks, but certainly two issues with that, with Netflix as a company. But I do agree streaming is the future, again, with the digitalization of consumption, and that's all part of it.
What about, Dana, the broader service industry? I don't want to be a downer, but New York City said today that COVID cases are rising again, and they may reimpose some mandates for masks and things. Have we gotten used to that, in the sense that we're going to be reluctant to go back to a lot of the things that we did before? People are going to be much less likely to say, hey, let's all go out to a restaurant or something like that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we're looking at the data, and certainly in the first quarter of this year, spending on services was really strong. Certainly in February and March, after Omicron swept through in January, people are looking to get out there and engage. But certainly, I don't think we'll get back to the levels that we saw prior to the pandemic, because now people figured out different ways of doing things. They figured out, how to work remotely, how to enjoy movies from home without having to pay $20 per person and pay $50 for popcorn and drinks and all that stuff.
Babysitters.
Exactly. So I think that certainly services consumption is going to be significantly affected by the pandemic, simply because a lot of it has gone digital, and people like that element of consumption and will continue to do that.
We only have a few minutes left, because I know, Professor, you've got a class to teach, I guess.
I actually do have.
We were thinking we could all go up to your classroom and sit in the back.
I hope, we're talking about mergers and vertical integration, all the good things we talked about.
Well, you said you don't do predictions, but I know one of the rules they tell you when you go to economic school is never make predictions. But if you have to, either give a number or a time frame, but never both. So I'll give you your choices of numbers or time frames as we kind of wrap this up with the outlook here. I think the question on most everybody's mind, and I'll start with you, Dana, is do we see a recession coming?
I foresaw that question.
You predicted that.
Yes, I did. So recession is not our base case, but certainly there are a lot of risks out there that could get us there very quickly. Number one is the escalation of the war in Ukraine. So if the European Union decides together, or even enough individual countries within the European Union decides to embargo Russian oil, then oil prices are going to spike, and you could see them jump up to $200 per barrel. And that's even assuming that you have the U.S. and, say, the UAE and Saudi Arabia jumping in to increase production by the end of this year. So you could see very high prices, and that's going to, again, feed back through inflation in the U.S. and cause weakness and growth. And certainly the transmission of that is through the consumer. So if prices go up too much and wages aren't tracking those price increases, and consumers pull back, Another big elephant in the room is Fed policy. So the Fed has said it's going to do, they haven't said we'll do whatever it takes, but it is focused on combating inflation. So the question is, does the Fed expect to bring down inflation gauges to its 2% target? And in doing so, would that cause a recession? Some people are saying the Fed is willing to do that. They're willing to cause a recession, and a recession is defined in a number of ways. The NBER defines it as weakness across a number of measures, including GDP and labor markets. I'm not as convinced, so I'm looking forward to tomorrow's meeting with Chair Powell, because I feel like the Fed would not necessarily want to erase all of the gains that it made in terms of achieving full employment. But again, we could enter into a recession if the Fed decides that, yes, it's going to do whatever it takes to get inflation back to 2%, even if that means a few quarters of negative GDP growth and weakening in the labor market. So those are two areas that I think could drive us to recession. Certainly the inflation aspects, and then what the Fed does about inflation.
We have an unusual situation in that we don't have an inventory overbuild, which leads to a lot of recessions. We don't have too many workers. We have too few workers. So I'm wondering, Professor, if we go to the world of physics, Heisenberg, and the principle that observing something changes its behavior, I'm wondering if we have to have a recession, or if people could almost be talked out of it, because we don't have a fundamental problem in the economy. We may have a belief problem.
Right, so certainly, so I don't do speculation, but I would say two or three things generally. First of all, I agree with Dana's analysis about all the possibilities. I would say that in my beginning of my career, I actually worked in energy economics. So I did do a lot of forecasts. I did some consulting, a lot of forecasts for energy. And the problem is you always forecast, you extrapolate from what's going on. And again, the reason why we can't predict is because all available information is already incorporated in prices. And the only thing that can happen is unexpected things, and those we can't predict by definition. Having said that, I'll say one other thing about our research. Actually, Gabriela just came in. So we have worked on another element of uncertainty in the market called ambiguity. And we were able to actually, in March, do a fairly good prediction of how markets are what markets are going to happen, but I can't, when we do have the numbers today, but I don't want to make predictions either because it's all uncertain. So I don't know if there will be a recession. I agree with Dana, the Fed can make it happen if they want to, but hopefully they won't.
Let me ask one last question of Dana, since I'm sure this is something that everybody out there is wondering. You don't have to give a number, but with interest rates going up and with maybe the economy slowing down, do house prices keep rising at astronomical levels, and which direction do gasoline prices go?
Sure. So first, with house prices, I think that in the interim we can have a bit of a slowdown because interest rates are rising, mortgage rates are going up. But over the medium term, I would say over the next 15 to 20 years, that's longer term, not medium, there's going to be very significant demand for housing from millennials. So if you think about it, there are over 70 million millennials, and the oldest ones are like 41, 42, and many of them have families. They're looking to buy a home. And so you're going to have an entire generation of people who want to purchase homes. So even though in the very short run we could have a little bit of a pullback in housing activity, I think the demand is quite strong over the next 2 decades for housing. So, and even if we do have in the interim, in the short run, a decline in housing prices, I don't foresee another housing crisis as we saw. First of all, people who are purchasing homes are better off. Their credit scores are higher. Their assets are firm. They're working. And also household balance sheets are in a lot better shape now than they were back way back when. And you also don't have the packaging, the repackaging of these assets mixed in with subprime and bad loans. We don't see as much as that happening now as we did back then. So I don't foresee a second housing crisis, even if you do have slowing because interest rates are rising.
And gasoline prices?
Oh.
Everybody wants to know about gasoline prices.
Yeah. Now I've decided not to sell my house, but wait. So tell me now what
Depends on whether you have to drive very far to get there.
That's right.
So gasoline prices are being driven in large part by what's happening with oil prices due to the war. So the key thing is there's demand and supply. Right now, demand for gasoline is very high. Certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, we're heading into the summer driving season. You also have people wanting to get back out there and go on vacation, so that's going to influence prices for airline tickets. But you asked about gasoline. The thing is that you're not really going to see prices come off until you see an increase in production. Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Gulf states do not want to increase production because they like having the revenue. Now their fiscal balances are in surplus. And then they can take that money and use it to wean themselves off of oil production. Meanwhile, in the United States, we can't just turn the spigots back on because we're having labor shortages, equipment shortages, and plus the very act of quote unquote turning the spigots back on is very labor intensive and time consuming. And plus you don't have the investment because we're supposed to be greening the global economy, moving away from fossil fuels, so investors aren't willing to spend the money. And so until you have a decrease in demand, either because gasoline prices are just way too high, people stop driving, and or an increase in production from the big main producers, you're not going to see much in terms of relief. And certainly within the U.S., I mean, you could forgive the gas taxes, but that's really not going to take much off of the price. And so I don't see a quick end in sight until maybe later on this year when you do have U.S. producers at least coming back into play.
Can I do one sentence on gasoline prices? So I think what we can learn from what happened in the previous crisis, when there's the war in the Middle East, and then the prices went up. So prices went a lot up, and then there were changes. Cars became a lot more efficient, and then the slightly longer on demand decline. Now here, we're talking, like Dana said, about greening. This will give a huge push to greening and do it a lot faster. Before we know it, we might have electric cars. So the Saudis are making money right now, but within a short period of time, few years down the road, that may be, gives a lot of push to technological change in that direction.
I would just say that, it is a dream that everyone drives an electric vehicle, but in the United States, we don't, again, going back to infrastructure, we don't have the infrastructure. Certainly, if everyone's driving an electric vehicle, how do you charge it? If you live in an apartment in New York City, where are you plugging it in, right? And even if you live in the middle of the country, where are you charging it? Are you going to spend 2 hours at a gasoline station charging your car? So before we can get there to this greening of the economy that is also, over the long run, disinflationary, there's the inflationary transition where we have to invest in order to make sure that we can actually support a greener, quote unquote, economy. So, sorry. Just dashed a little cold
Well, on
water
that happy note, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up. I got a note from your students that said, keep him 10 more minutes and then we'll pretend he's not coming and we can all leave. But the dean said, no, we got to let you go. So thank you very much, both of you. Dr. Ravid and Dana Peterson, thank you for being with us today. Thank Yeshiva for everything, and especially for establishing the Bloomberg Laboratory. We're very excited about that, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.